you think Ottoman harems were just silken beds, jeweled concubines, and whispered politics. But behind the veils of Topkapi and Dolmabahce lay another theatre of desire. One not spoken of in tourist brochures, one erased in official histories. But it existed, and it was celebrated. Before we continue, if you want more of this kind of buried history, subscribe now. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps keep these shadows alive, and it tells us you value truths hidden behind the marble walls. The Ottoman harem is usually imagined as a kingdom of women, concubines, wives, and eunuchs in gilded captivity. But the truth was stranger. Alongside the odalisques and courtesans stood male attendants. Young boys, youths chosen for beauty, purchased, trained, and displayed. Not hidden, not rare, celebrated. European envoys whispered of them in coded letters. Travelers hinted at them in scandalized diaries. Ottoman chroniclers softened the words, but the reality bled through. The harem was not only about women, it was about power, and power consumed whatever it desired. The boys were called köçek. The word meant dancer, but it meant much more. They were boys of extraordinary beauty, often no older than 12, dressed in silks, painted with kohl, trained to dance, to sing, to please. They twirled in the sultan's feasts, hips swaying, faces lit with forced smiles, not toys, not ornaments, instruments of pleasure. The köçek phenomenon spread across the empire. From palace halls in Istanbul to provincial mansions in Anatolia, boys danced. Their movements were stylized, their costumes deliberately feminine, bells tied to their ankles, faces powdered, hair long and perfumed. Audiences roared. Men showered them with coins, jewels, and sometimes proposals. The line between spectacle and exploitation never existed. It was the same line of domination. These boys came from everywhere, captured in wars, sold by desperate families, snatched from villages under the devshirme system where Christian children were taken to serve the state. Some became soldiers in the janissaries, others became administrators. But a chosen few, judged too beautiful for battle, were funneled into performance. Their fate was to amuse, arouse, and submit. The palace archives hint at their regulation. Registers list payments to köçek troops, clothing budgets, musicians employed to accompany them. This wasn't underground vice. It was institutional, organized, protected by the same machinery that guarded the throne. And the boys had no choice. Their beauty was a sentence. Ottoman poets wrote verses about them. Their eyes like almonds, their lips like pomegranate seeds, their voices compared to nightingales. The metaphors made it art. The reality was that children were being eroticized by the empire's elite. Not hidden, not shameful, celebrated. In feasts, the köçek were expected to inflame the atmosphere. Their dances simulated seduction. They bent low, gazes, coy movements suggestive. The crowds shouted, intoxicated by wine and music. The Sultan watched. Sometimes he chose. To be chosen meant more silks, more jewels, but also more captivity. It was an honor that broke lives. European observers recoiled and fantasized in equal measure. Some condemned the practice as barbaric. Others painted it as exotic decadence, proof of Eastern otherness. But their own courts had their pages and choirboys. Hypocrisy flowed across borders. Exploited children looked the same in Istanbul or in Rome. Only the costumes changed. Inside, the harem hierarchy decided everything. Women schemed for influence, eunuchs controlled the gates, and the boys floated in between, belonging to no category. Neither men nor women, neither slaves nor free. They existed in a grey zone where every right was stripped away. They were tools of entertainment. They were bodies offered to appetites. Survival depended on obedience. A boy who resisted risked exile to rough labor. Or worse, punishments were brutal. Sources mention lashings, brandings, mutilations. Submission was the only path to protection. Even then, protection was temporary. Once age dulled their beauty, their value evaporated. They were cast out, abandoned, or reassigned. Disposable lives in a palace that consumed endlessly. The moral justification was always the same. It wasn't exploitation. It was tradition. It wasn't abuse. It was refinement. The dances were framed as cultural artistry, the relationships as mentorship, the poetry as appreciation. But strip away the words and the reality was exploitation sanctified by music, law, and empire. Religion hovered in uneasy silence. Islamic law condemned sodomy, yet the köçek thrived. Clerics denounced them from pulpits, but the sultans kept them in their courts. The contradiction was never resolved. Morality bowed to power. as it always does. The system revealed the empire's deepest truth. Power didn't just conquer lands, it conquered bodies. Men, women, and children alike became resources. The harem wasn't just a pleasure palace, it was a factory of submission, a machine that manufactured obedience from flesh. By the 17th century, the Kochek were everywhere. They danced in weddings, banquets, military victories. Their fame rivaled that of female courtesans. Some troops had followings across provinces. They became celebrities of their time. But celebrity never meant freedom. It meant higher stakes, greater exposure, and deeper chains. When Western powers pressed against the empire, the Kochek became propaganda. Orientalist painters filled canvases with imagined harems of boys and women alike. The West gawked. The East consumed. The boys remained trapped in the middle, their lives erased beneath layers of fantasy. Historians today often skim past them. The harem is still described as feminine, the eunuchs as guardians. The boys disappear from the narrative. Silence protects reputations. Silence erases victims. Silence allows the empire to remain remembered for architecture and conquests, not for the children broken behind velvet curtains. The Ottoman harems weren't just about desire, they were about domination. Children reduced to dancers, women reduced to wombs, slaves reduced to property, all under the banner of imperial glory. The victims had no voice, the system had all the words. The powerful wrote poems, the powerful painted scenes, the powerful sang songs. The victims left only whispers. No journals, no monuments, only fragments in hostile archives, where their existence is noted as line items in expense accounts. This is how power immortalizes itself, and how it deletes those it destroys. The lesson is brutal and clear. When power legalizes pleasure, suffering disappears from the record. The victims become shadows, the crimes become culture, and history remembers beauty, not pain. You think the Ottoman palace was guarded by eunuchs for purity, neutral, sterile, harmless figures blocking sin. But behind their castrated bodies lay another story, one more disturbing, one more revealing. Subscribe if you haven't yet and tell us your country in the comments. It keeps these silenced voices alive. It tells us we're not alone in pulling history out of the shadows. Now, let's go deeper. The eunuchs ruled the gates of the harem. They were the threshold keepers, their bodies mutilated so they could never threaten the women. But their presence didn't make the palace moral. It made it crueler, because the system cut them first, and then used them as instruments of further exploitation. Most eunuchs were taken as boys, captured in Africa, bought in the markets of Cairo, cut by knives before puberty, their voices forever altered, their futures stolen. They were sold into service with no hope of families, descendants, or legacy. Their only role obedience. Not hidden, not rare, institutionalized. But they were not just guards. They were the managers of intimacy. They brought girls to the sultan. They trained boys to dance. They arranged the spectacles that entertained the throne. Their mutilation was supposed to strip them of desire, yet desire still swirled in the corridors they controlled. The contradiction was obvious. The empire pretended to solve sin by creating greater suffering. The grand eunuch, chief of them all, held enormous power. He advised the sultan, mediated between concubines, and controlled palace access. No one entered the harem without his approval. He had the eyes of a mutilated boy, but the authority of a minister. That power was absolute within the palace walls. It made him a king of shadows. Historians often describe eunuchs as neutral servants. But neutrality disappears when you control who shares the sultan's bed. They curated pleasure like administrators. They knew which girl was favored, which boy would be called to dance. They became orchestrators of bodies, their suffering recycled into the suffering of others. The harem wasn't just a chamber of sex, it was an economy. Slaves were its currency. Women and boys were traded, bought and discarded. Eunuchs ensured the market functioned. They logged expenses. They enforced discipline. They silenced rebellion with whip and chain. The palace wasn't hiding these roles. It wrote them down in payroll records. Imagine the daily rhythm. A concubine wakes bathed and perfumed. A boy rehearses bells tied to ankles. A eunuch orders food, checks costumes, prepares the hall. Everything designed for spectacle. Everything designed for the appetite of one man. The Sultan ruled with armies outside, but inside he ruled with desire. Travelers in the 17th century wrote of these feasts. They described golden trays of sherbet, roasted meats, rivers of wine, and always the dancers, sometimes women, sometimes boys. The eunuchs placed them before the throne like offerings. The court cheered. The empire devoured. This wasn't hidden from the empire's elite. Governors, generals, and judges attended. They praised the dances. They competed for the sultan's favor by sponsoring troops of boys. Owning beautiful slaves became a mark of status. Men flaunted them as living trophies, proof of wealth and refinement. Abuse disguised as culture. Exploitation painted as art. Religion again bent under pressure. Clerics thundered against sodomy, but the palace continued. Laws forbade intoxicants, yet wine flowed in fountains. Sermons warned of hellfire, but the sultans turned their gaze elsewhere. In the empire, faith could be strict for the poor but elastic for the powerful. For the women in the harem, the presence of boys created new humiliations. A concubine might wait years for a glance from the sultan. Yet a boy dancer could be summoned after one feast. Women who thought themselves rivals for power discovered that power had no gender boundaries. Desire swept past them to whoever glittered most brightly. The boys, for all their forced celebrity, lived fragile lives. A slip in performance meant punishment. Age meant dismissal. They were chained to beauty's short lifespan. Some discarded, drifted into poverty. Others became prostitutes in Istanbul's alleys. A few rose by attaching themselves to patrons, exchanging one form of captivity for another. None chose the path. All walked it. Western visitors documented this with fascination. Their sketches show boys in embroidered jackets, hair tied with ribbons. Their reports drip with scandal and envy. They called it decadence, yet their own societies hired castrati to sing in cathedrals, boys mutilated for beauty. Hypocrisy, dressed in different robes. The cycle never stopped. Boys entered young dazzled courts for a few years, then vanished. Women bore sons, some of whom became sultans. Eunuchs ruled the gates until death. And the system ground forward. It lasted centuries. Longer than many kingdoms survived. That longevity meant legitimacy. Generations forgot it was cruel. They learned to call it tradition. The moral lesson is stark. When cruelty lasts long enough, it becomes invisible. It hides inside poetry, music, and ritual. It hides inside the words of rulers and the silence of victims. The Ottoman harem's beauty was purchased with blood. The songs of its boys carried echoes of screams. You think the Ottoman army was only janissaries, disciplined, loyal, fierce soldiers who built an empire. But behind the muskets and banners lay another truth. The army was also fed by the same system that fed the harem. Children taken, boys reshaped, lives consumed. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Leave a comment with your country. It helps us know who values history stripped of its golden masks. Now let's step into the barracks where military power and sexual politics mixed. The janissaries were legendary. Christian boys taken through Devshirme, converted to Islam, trained as soldiers, indoctrinated as servants of the Sultan. Their loyalty was unmatched. But the price of that loyalty was childhood. Their families wept while the empire celebrated. Not hidden, not rare. Institutionalized. Not all taken boys became warriors. Some were sorted by beauty. The strong went to the barracks, the beautiful to the palaces. The line between soldier and courtesan was paper thin. One carried a musket, the other carried bells and silks. Both carried chains. Inside the army camps, exploitation was not unusual. Boys lived in dormitories, stripped of family, surrounded by older soldiers. Brotherhood was the ideal, but beneath it grew relationships framed as mentorship, enforced as domination. Commanders called it discipline. Recruits knew it as abuse. Spartan echoes lingered. Just as Greek warriors bonded through physical submission, janissaries replicated similar patterns. Strength was tested. Submission demanded. Love, intimacy, and violence fused in ways that destroyed innocence. The military did not deny it. They accepted it as part of shaping loyalty. Ottoman poets praised the beauty of young soldiers. Descriptions of cheeks like roses, voices like music, bodies like willow branches. These were not abstract metaphors. They were coded admissions. The army that conquered Europe also consumed its children. Within the empire, this was no scandal. It was praised as refinement. Men who had a favorite were envied. The beauty of youths was currency, traded in camps as much as weapons or horses. To resist was to lose protection. To submit was to survive. The Janissary Corps had its own hierarchy of desire. Young boys entering at 12 or 13 were most vulnerable. By 18 their role shifted. They became aggressors instead of victims, repeating the cycle. Abuse turned into tradition, and tradition became identity. The cycle lasted centuries. No reform erased it. No sermon ended it. The core normalized it, singing songs of loyalty while hiding wounds of exploitation. And every empire that feared their muskets ignored the cries of their children. European observers noticed. They wrote letters describing boys marching in formation by day, entertaining officers by night. They condemned it publicly while privately tolerating similar systems at home. The difference was scale. The Ottoman system industrialized it, bureaucratized it, perfected it. Religion again bent under power. Scholars wrote treatises denouncing forbidden acts. Soldiers prayed in formation, fasting in Ramadan. Yet at night indulgence replaced discipline. Sin was ignored when it served the empire's needs. The law of God was wielded against the weak but set aside for the strong. For enslaved boys, military or harem, there was no distinction. Both were caught in nets cast by the same state. Both faced choices that weren't choices. Dance or march, submit or be punished. Their bodies used for empire's pleasure or empire's power. Both paths erased their humanity. The army also trafficked in spectacle. Victories were celebrated with feasts, and feasts demanded dancers. Sometimes concubines, sometimes boys. Soldiers returned from campaigns not only with spoils of war but with captives chosen for beauty. Some were turned into kochek, others into janissaries, all into property. The empire blurred every line, soldier or slave, boy or concubine, entertainment or discipline. Every category dissolved into the same reality: domination by the powerful. That is why the Ottoman system endured. It was flexible enough to consume anyone. When the Janissary Corps was finally abolished in the 19th century, reformers portrayed it as military modernization. But beneath the surface it was also a partial burial of these practices. The empire wanted European respect. That meant erasing some of its darkest traditions. Records were destroyed, voices silenced, memory rewritten. The lesson is unavoidable. The same empire that built mosques, libraries, and armies also devoured children. The power that spread from Istanbul to Budapest carried more than banners. It carried scars. The military's glory was not separate from the harem's shame. They were two arms of the same body. You think the harem was only filled with willing beauties, women competing for jewels, power, and the sultan's affection. But behind the velvet cushions and perfumed baths lay another truth. Most of those women had no choice. They were captives. They were slaves. If you value uncovering these silent stories, subscribe now. Drop a comment with your country. It shows us where this dark history reaches, and it keeps the voices of the forgotten alive. The women of the harem came from everywhere. Circassian villages in the Caucasus, Greek islands, Balkan towns, Armenian valleys, sold by fathers, stolen by raiders, or taken as tribute. The empire called it custom. Families called it survival. Girls were uprooted, renamed, and remade. Not hidden, not rare, systematic. Inside they were trained, taught to walk, sing, and serve. Their bodies turned into currency. A concubine could be gifted to a loyal vizier, traded for political alliances, or kept for the sultan's pleasure. Beauty was their only shield, but it was also their prison. Marriage meant nothing here. Consent meant nothing here. The sultan's will was law. When he pointed, a girl entered his chamber. Whether she was 12, 14, or 20 did not matter. Her value was measured by youth purity and her ability to produce heirs. The wedding night was often celebrated as a festival. In truth, it was state-sanctioned violation. Ottoman law codified this hierarchy. A concubine could never refuse. She was property. Her child, if male, could become a prince. But she herself remained a slave until the sultan freed her. Some rose to positions of power, even influencing politics. But their influence was born of suffering, not choice. The silence around abuse was total. A woman who resisted could be beaten, strangled, or drowned. Tales circulate of sacks filled with disobedient concubines thrown into the Bosphorus. Whether legend or fact, the fear was real. Death was the reminder that beauty was temporary and obedience eternal. Religion again bent to power. Islamic law demanded consent in marriage. But the palace rewrote reality. Scholars justified the harem as legal concubinage. Clerics turned their heads away. The empire cloaked abuse in sanctity. Women disappeared into the gap between scripture and sultan. The harem was more than bedrooms. It was a factory of heirs. Every concubine's true purpose was to bear sons. Those sons competed for the throne. Their mothers schemed for influence. Rivalries turned bloody. Poisonings, assassinations, and strangulations followed. The women lived inside cages of silk, but those cages echoed with terror. Slave markets in Istanbul fueled this system. Travelers described rows of young girls displayed like livestock. Buyers inspected teeth, skin, and hair. A bid a sale, and the girl vanished into a palace. Some became favorites. Others washed floors invisible until they aged and died in anonymity. European observers obsessed over the harem. They painted it as exotic, sensual, mysterious. They imagined seductions and pleasures. But they ignored the chains. They ignored the girls sold before puberty. They ignored the corpses that vanished into the waters at night. Their fantasy erased the victims. And even when women rose, their power remained fragile. The famous Valide Sultan, mother of the reigning sultan, could command armies and ministers. But she too began as a captive. Her influence came not from freedom but from her son's throne. Her story was exceptional, and exceptions only underline the rule. The daily life of most concubines was monotony. Hours of waiting, endless grooming, harsh discipline. Every move watched by eunuchs. Every rival a potential threat. The palace that outsiders imagined as paradise was for most inside a prison gilded with cruelty. The harem created illusions. Women smiled in paintings. Poets praised their beauty. Visitors imagined romance. But reality was violence polished into ritual. The empire consumed, youth replaced it, and buried the memory. The women had no voices. Only songs written by others celebrating a world they could not escape. The lesson is blunt. When power legalizes ownership of people, exploitation becomes invisible. The women of the harem were not lovers of sultans. They were slaves of empire. Their pain was erased, their names forgotten, their beauty consumed by rulers who called it tradition. You think religion inside the empire was pure faith. Mosques filled with prayers, scholars with wisdom and worship untainted. But behind the call to prayer lay rituals of desire. Magic spells and sanctified exploitation hidden in plain sight. Faith became another mask for domination. If you haven't subscribed, do it now. Leave a comment telling us where you're from. It helps us shine light on history buried by empires, and it keeps this channel alive to tell it. The Ottomans wrapped their empire in Islam. They built mosques, schools, and law courts. Religion was everywhere, but so was magic. Amulets, incantations, and love spells thrived in the shadows. Officials condemned them, but powerful men used them. They believed no sin was too great if desire demanded. Magic was not marginal. It was mainstream. Archaeologists have uncovered binding tablets inscribed with pleas to spirits, words demanding that a woman or a boy become consumed with lust. Buried under thresholds, hidden in fountains, not hidden, not rare, celebrated. The belief was simple and horrifying. If someone resisted, magic could break them. Consent was unnecessary. Spells forced desire, twisted will, and erased choice. The system of power already crushed people physically. Magic crushed them spiritually. Ottoman texts describe these practices openly. Manuals of sorcery list recipes. Wax figures pierced with pins. Perfumes laced with herbs. Chants repeated under moonlight. A boy dancer could be bound to a patron. A concubine chained to a sultan. The empire's laws said one thing, but desire always found another tool. Clerics denounced sorcery, but the palace used it. Sultans consulted astrologers before battles. Viziers carried talismans. Eunuchs distributed charms. The contradiction was obvious. Religion preached morality while rulers bent it into instruments of control. Faith became cover for power. Women in the harem were especially targeted. They wore amulets not of their own choosing. These amulets were imposed, meant to subdue, to make them compliant. A necklace might look like ornament. In truth, it was a chain of magic binding her body to obedience. The boys were no safer. Patrons terrified of losing their favorites turned to sorcery. A spell could make a boy crave the very man he feared. Desire forced into his veins, until he no longer knew which feelings were his, and which were the empire's curse. Travelers hinted at these practices in their diaries. They saw shrines filled with offerings, heard chants at night, and wrote of an empire where faith and magic were inseparable. The West mocked it as superstition, but their own courts practiced alchemy and witchcraft. Hypocrisy once again cloaked the cruelty. Magic gave the empire plausible deniability. A boy who suddenly adored his patron was not seen as a victim. He was enchanted. A concubine who stopped resisting was said to be blessed. The cruelty was erased, replaced with myth. Suffering became wonder. Abuse became miracle. The victims disappeared into silence. They could not resist spells any more than chains. Their bodies became extensions of rituals they never chose. The empire claimed divine blessing for practices that desecrated the very concept of faith. The persistence of magic reveals something darker. It shows that domination was not satisfied with obedience of the body. It wanted obedience of the soul. A slave might obey outwardly, but magic ensured they obeyed inwardly too. This was conquest beyond flesh. It was conquest of spirit. Even today, fragments of these practices survive. Charms against envy, spells for attraction, superstitions whispered in villages. They look harmless now, but centuries ago they were weapons in the arsenal of power. And behind every charm lay stories of victims coerced into submission they could not resist. The moral lesson is sharp. When power mixes with religion, even faith becomes a weapon. The Ottomans used God and magic in the same breath, twisting both into tools of control. The result was suffering, invisible, sanctified, and eternal. You think slavery in the empire was only labor, fields, kitchens, and construction sites filled with captives. But behind palace walls, slavery became something darker. It became entertainment. It became pleasure. If you value these erased stories, subscribe now. Comment with your country. It tells us where these forgotten victims are finally being remembered. It helps us keep digging into history's shadows. The Ottoman economy thrived on slavery. Markets in Istanbul, Cairo, and Damascus overflowed with human bodies. Men for labor, women for wombs, boys for beauty. The state taxed the trade. The palace consumed the results. Not hidden, not rare, institutionalized. Slaves filled every corner of the harem. They bathed concubines, dressed princes, polished marble floors. But some were chosen for more intimate duties. Female slaves became concubines. Male slaves became companions. Their value was measured not by skill, but by flesh. The archives list them coldly. Inventories of households show categories: cooks, gardeners, guards, and gazelles, the beautiful ones. These were boys and girls whose sole purpose was to please. Official records filed them alongside livestock, a cruel reminder that the empire saw them as property. Beauty was both blessing and curse. A beautiful child might escape hard labor but enter captivity far worse. They could be sold for high prices, placed in palaces, and paraded as status symbols. Their faces became tickets to survival, but their souls were destroyed. Punishments were brutal. A slave who resisted faced whipping, mutilation, or execution. Some sources describe sacks tied with stones, bodies tossed into the Bosphorus. Disobedience erased not only life but also memory. No tombstones, no names, just silence beneath the water. The system produced generations of victims. Children born to enslaved women became slaves themselves. Sons could be taken for armies, daughters funneled into harems. The cycle renewed itself endlessly, feeding the empire's machine. Slavery wasn't a side effect. It was a foundation. Travelers recorded shocking scenes. Slave markets where naked children stood trembling under the gaze of buyers. Auctions where men inspected bodies like cattle. Crowds cheering as dancers, boys dressed as girls, performed for coins. The spectacle was public. The cruelty was normalized. The empire justified it as law. Slaves captured in war were legal spoils. Non-Muslims were eligible. Purchase and ownership had rules, contracts, and taxes. It was bureaucracy masking barbarity. Paperwork turned screams into receipts. Even when manumission occurred, freedom was rarely real. Former slaves remained tied to patrons, bound by debt, obligation, or fear. Their bodies carried scars, their futures carried limits. Few escaped fully. Most lived in shadows, reminders of the system's reach. Western observers condemned Ottoman slavery loudly. Yet they profited from their own plantations, their own human markets. Their outrage was theater. Their pens dripped with hypocrisy. They judged the East while ignoring chains in their own colonies. The palace consumed most of all. Sultans demanded fresh faces. Viziers demanded gifts of human beauty. Generals returned from campaigns with wagons of captives. The state's victories were measured not only in land but in flesh. Conquest and slavery were inseparable. The voices of slaves are almost entirely gone. Few left writings. Few had monuments. Their existence is pieced together through court records, traveler accounts, and fragments of poetry. Their silence is the loudest evidence. They were erased not just in life but in memory. What remains is the pattern. Children stolen, women trapped, boys displayed, magic invoked, armies fed, religion bent. Every system of the empire intersected at the same point: domination of the powerless. The victims became the raw material of Ottoman glory. The marble palaces still stand, the domes still glitter, the mosques still echo with prayers. But beneath them lie bones of those consumed for pleasure. The empire's monuments are built on silenced cries. That is the true foundation of imperial splendor. The moral lesson cannot be softened. When empires sanctify cruelty, it becomes invisible. When cruelty becomes invisible, it survives for centuries. The Ottoman harem was not a paradise of silks and roses. It was a prison of bodies where power consumed children, women, slaves, and souls. And history still prefers to forget.